Grüß Gott YouTube und willkommen zum Ask Maestro! Today's question comes from Facebook user Travis Scherer, who asks, why are so many famous composers Austrian? In order to answer this question, first we have to figure out what even is Austria. Now, from the vantage point of today, that sounds like a simple question to answer. Austria is a Central European country. It borders Switzerland, Germany, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, and Italy. It's got Alps, it's got waltzes, its capital is Vienna. They speak German and they eat schnitzel. But things were not always so neat and tidy. Prior to World War I, what was referred to as Austria was this bloated multinational empire called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it spanned a vast swath of Central Europe, including all or most of modern-day Hungary, Romania, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Italy, Serbia, Croatia, Poland, and even Ukraine. Now, this state, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was synonymous with the Habsburg dynasty, a royal family that ruled over this part of Europe for close to a millennium. Now, this Austro-Hungarian Empire had two sides, the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. And prior to 1867, they were officially two separate states. But here's the thing. The reigning Habsburg ruled over both. He was simultaneously the Emperor of Austria as well as the King of Hungary. Now, whichever way you slice it, the Austrian Empire was multinational and multi-ethnic. So who exactly were the ethnic Austrians? Well, this question is further complicated by the fact that the Austrian side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was part of a larger supranational organization called the German Confederation. Most German-speaking Austrians probably didn't feel themselves as being separate from the rest of the citizens of the many German states. Now, I'm from the United States, but if I were to meet a Canadian, say, who was also an English-speaking Anglo-descended person, I wouldn't think of that person as being of a separate ethnicity from me, but we just happen to live in two different countries. Okay, so with all this in mind, let's take a look at the composers who we might consider to be Austrian. Well, first off, there are the composers who lived and worked in Vienna, which was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and remains the capital of modern-day Austria. Now, you'll see a lot of familiar names like Brahms and Beethoven, Mozart, Schubert. But now let's take a look at the composers who were actually born within the boundaries of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now there are a few more names, composers who were born within these boundaries but did not live and work primarily in Vienna, like Dvorak and Liszt. You'll also notice that Beethoven and Brahms were not born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in spite of the fact that we closely associate them with the city of Vienna. Okay, now let's narrow down this list a little bit further, because we know that there were two halves of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian half and the Hungarian half. So here are the composers who were born in the Austrian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And now, here are the ones who were born within the boundaries of present-day Austria, and these are the ones who grew up speaking German. Okay, there are a few surprises when we lay out the information this way. Mozart, who we consider to be the poster boy of Austrian composers, was not actually born in Austria. He was born in a tiny little country called the Archbishopric of Salzburg. Now, admittedly, this region was swallowed up by the Austrian Empire in 1805, and this area does lie within the boundaries of modern-day Austria, so I think that we can pretty comfortably loop in Mozart with the rest of the Austrian horde. Now, another interesting outlier is Franz Liszt, and it might be surprising to see his name listed in a group of Austrian composers, because if you know anything about Liszt, you probably think of him as being the prototypical Hungarian composer. He wrote all of those Hungarian rhapsodies, and he referred to himself as a Magyar, an ethnic Hungarian. Now, Liszt was born on the Hungarian side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he was born right on the border, and the city where he was born, Haydn, is now part of modern-day Austria. And here's the thing. Liszt grew up in an ethnically German household. His parents spoke German. He never learned a lick of Hungarian. And in fact, his name looks Hungarian, but it wasn't. His father changed the spelling of their name to make it easier for the Hungarians whom they lived among to pronounce it. And just a side note, what kind of a messed up language is Hungarian where putting a Z in the middle of a word makes it easier to pronounce? So even though Liszt thought of himself as Hungarian, I think that a case can certainly be made that he was really an Austrian composer. Okay, here's another surprising one to see on the list. Antonín Dvořák. Once again, we think of Antonín Dvořák as being a deeply nationalistic composer, this time of the Czech nation. He grew up in an ethnically Czech household speaking the Czech language, but he grew up in the Czech part of the Austrian Empire. It was called Bohemia, and as such, Dvorak was an Austrian citizen. Now this worked out pretty well for Dvorak. He lived and worked in Prague, but he was still eligible to apply for a grant from the Austrian Ministry of Education that was designed to help struggling young artists throughout the empire. Through this, he came to the attention of Johannes Brahms, and he became a wildly popular composer, in part due to the fact that he wrote music that had this slightly exotic Czech sound to it. So the moral of this story is that the question of a person's national identity is often a very complicated one. But one thing's for sure, Vienna did in fact become the world capital of Western art music in the 18th and 19th centuries. So how did that happen? Well, you'll remember from my Why Italian video that during the Baroque era, Italy was really the center of musical activity in Europe. Composers from every other country went to Italy to study music, and Italian musicians were imported to all of the major courts across Europe. Did the Habsburgs have Italian musicians? You better bet they did. Starting in the 17th century, the Austrian emperors stocked their courts lavishly with Italian musicians. But the thing that separated the Habsburgs is that they were truly a music-loving family. Many of the emperors were composers themselves, and almost all of them played music as a pastime. Now, as the Austrian Empire grew, Vienna became a major world capital. So you had visiting dignitaries coming into town, and of course music was required for all of the official ceremonies surrounding these events. Now, another organization that needed big ceremonious music was the Catholic Church. And whereas the northern German states had reformed to Protestantism, Austria remained staunchly Catholic. Now, this was also an empire where many different ethnicities and peoples came into contact with each other. The Hungarians, the Moravians, the Bohemians, and all of these nations within the empire had very rich and interesting folk music traditions. So with this increasing musicalization of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the groundwork was laid for a truly exceptional musician to come in and take the scene by storm. And that musician was Franz Joseph Haydn. By any measure, Joseph Haydn was an Austrian. He was born within all of those borders that we talked about. He spoke German. He was so Austrian that he even wrote the Austrian national anthem. And he represents all of these things that we talked about. He studied music with one of those imported Italian musicians, Nicola Popera. He spent almost his entire career working for one of the music-loving members of the nobility, the Esterházy family. He incorporated folk music from Slovenia and Serbia, Hungary, Moravia. And he took all of these influences and he forged them into a unique style. Now, Haydn came into his maturity during Mozart's childhood. And of course, Mozart was hugely influenced by the music of Haydn, and they had a very genial, kind of paternalistic relationship. Then Beethoven came onto the scene. Now, Beethoven and Haydn had a totally different relationship. It was antagonistic. Their personalities just didn't match. Beethoven was in many ways an opportunistic striver, and Haydn was a very cordial gentleman. But the fact is, classical music would not be what it is today without the works of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. In fact, we refer to their music as the classical style. And this is all it took for Vienna to become the focal point of the musical world. And of course, it became a very attractive spot for other major musicians to come. Brahms moved there from Hamburg. Later on, you had another triumvirate of composers, often called the Second Viennese School. These were Schoenberg, Webern, and Berg. And they, of course, had a major influence on music in the middle portion of the 20th century. And there are still Austrian composers today. One of the most interesting musicians in the world is Georg Friedrich Haas. So have there really been more composers who have come from Austria than, say, from France or Italy or Russia? Maybe not, but there certainly have been a lot of very important and influential ones who came from Austria. And the fact that Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven all had such outsized talents, and the fact that they all lived and worked in the same place at the same time, is largely responsible for our view of Austria being a major producer of great composers. Okay, YouTube, that is it for this episode of Ask a Maestro. Thank you so much, Travis Scherer, for this excellent question. The rest of you, please leave your questions in the comments, on the Facebook page, on Twitter. Go ahead and give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And until the next time I see you, spiel einen Instrument oder sing ein Lied. Und bis dann, tschüss alle.